All right, so as noted, this is going to be a bit of a case study on a Drupal 7 to Backdrop project that we've done with some more generic Drupal 7 to Backdrop information throughout. And as mentioned, any questions you have, we can try to get to at the end. Just as a bit of background on Stanford Bio-X, this is a pioneering interdisciplinary biosciences institute at Stanford, and they had this website that's been around for many years, had a ton of rich content that they wanted to maintain on the next version of the website. So the situation at the start of the project was they had a Drupal 7 site, had some complexity to it. They also indicated they didn't need to drastically change any of the information architecture that had been built fairly well early on. And so the content types and the fields and all of that was going to stay, fairly consistent to what they had on the Drupal 7 site. There was a lot of content in these different content types and pulled into the site in different ways that also the goal was to preserve. They were largely satisfied with how the site looked and functioned, so they didn't want a full-scale redesign. And the staff was knowledgeable in how to get everything done that needed to be done, so they were fairly well trained in the Drupal 7 interface. And of course, hanging over everything, the Drupal 7 end of life was and is kind of looming. I'll talk about that a little bit more in another slide coming up here as well. Actually, this slide. So last week, the Drupal team made an announcement about the Drupal 7 end of life being bumped one more time. They've bumped it a few times with some additional caveats saying this will be the final one. We're not going to do it again. I also think it's notable that some of the changes that have been announced now in this most recent announcement will begin to phase in before the previously announced end of life bump date, which was November 2023. So August 1, which is only a month and a half from now, some of these phase outs will begin. And I think that's kind of a way to say, like, this end of life is not going to change again, and we're going to kind of try to taper things down. The support is not going to be as full-throated as it was before. So all that to say, I think that it's probably a good idea to keep your migration plan to get off of Drupal 7 on the front burner and not use this as a reason to push it to the back burner. So if you're coming from a Drupal 7 site, you've obviously got some options. You could migrate to Drupal 9, 10. You could migrate to WordPress or even something else entirely, potentially. We've got a graphic here that kind of gives you a simplified version of what these options could mean for a good number of groups. If you've got some higher end needs in terms of media management or authoring tools, like you really like the Mercury editor, that's not available except through Drupal 9 and 10. And if you've got an ecosystem that's all built around modern Drupal, it may make sense to go to Drupal 9 and 10. If you want to start fresh and simple, WordPress could be a good option. But especially if you're coming from Drupal 7, Backdrop should definitely be a strong part of your consideration. And this case study will kind of go through some of the reasons why that is. But in short, if you're familiar with your current website and you know how to get everything done, it's going to be familiar to you, but with improvements. And there's also a direct upgrade path instead of a migration process, which helps with the budget, makes it quicker and cheaper to migrate or to upgrade to Backdrop instead of to migrate to something else. So in the case of Bio-X, there wasn't a real clear need to go to Drupal 9 or WordPress because they didn't need any of the D9 specific functionality. Cost was a factor. They didn't have unlimited budget. And as I mentioned, the information architecture wasn't changing greatly. And so starting from scratch seemed like an unnecessary thing to do. Also, the content that needed to be preserved from all these different years in a migration would need to be, exported and then imported and so on. So that was an additional step, which adds to cost. And all of these things, particularly in this case, made Backdrop a perfect fit because it solves the end-of-life uncertainty. The direct upgrade path saves a ton of time in terms of content coming over, information architecture, the content types, the fields, the views, all that being preserved. And then once you've done the upgrade, you can, of course, tweak and modify and improve and iterate on what you have. You don't have to leave it exactly like it was if you don't want to, but using that as a basis for the upgraded site saved a ton of time and therefore money. And even in this case, elements of the theme could be reused because the theming is so similar between Drupal 7 and Backdrop. I will get into a little more nuts and bolts about that coming up as well. So on top of all of that, as a bonus, Backdrop is not just Drupal 7 with without an end of life. There's been a ton of improvements that have gone into the Backdrop core. And so all of those were gained as part of this upgrade as well in terms of accessibility, performance, and usability. New features have been added. I'll get into more depth on configuration management and layouts that are in Backdrop core. And as mentioned, the administrative interface was familiar but improved. And so some of the workarounds that had been developed over the years for some of the rough edges of the Drupal 7 administration either were already fixed in Backdrop core, or some of the workarounds that were particular to the content on this site could be noted, and as part of this upgrade could be simplified and smoothed out and make the administration simpler in the end. And then the extra room that was left in the budget could be applied to other areas and other improvements, as I'll discuss a little bit going forward as well. So here's a side-by-side comparison of the Drupal 7 site from before the upgrade and then a recent screenshot of the Backdrop site. So you can see in this case, the desire was to match pretty closely the theme and so on. And there's a few things you can probably spot that are differences here that were intentional changes related to accessibility or things like that. But you can see how closely you can match if you desire to. Now, most of you may have a general sense of what Backdrop is, but just in case, I'm going to give a quick overview. Backdrop is a fork of Drupal, and it actually comes from the thin space that's in between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. So it includes many of the improvements that went into Drupal 8 right up until the point when the architecture began to change the most dramatically with Symfony and Composer and Twig and all of that. So this means that unlike going from Drupal 7 to later versions of Drupal, you can actually directly upgrade to Backdrop from Drupal 7. And the principles that I have printed on the screen here are some of the principles that Backdrop, the project, is based on. Things intended to make the system flexible, powerful, predictable, secure, affordable, and make sure it remains open source. So all that's kind of a quick background on where Backdrop fits into the Drupal world. I'm going to be getting slightly technical on a few of these next slides, but I'll try not to get too deep into the weeds, but try to cover some of the big concepts you might be interested in related to Backdrop as compared to Drupal 7. In Drupal 7, your theme also defines your regions and the structure of your page. And in Backdrop, this is kind of split into two parts so that you have the theme, which controls, colors and fonts and the visuals, and then a new layout system that controls the structure of the page and the regions and so on. And I have a little bit deeper dive on that coming up. So in terms of the Bio-X project in this case study, as I mentioned, the goal was to recreate the existing theme without a major redesign. Other sites may wish to do the same, but you could also do a refresh or even a complete redesign at this point. So we were able to pull some sections of CSS directly from the existing site. It's also possible to largely use the template files that customize particular content types, fields, and so on with minor edits, since Backdrop uses the same theme engine and format as Drupal 7 does. So that's one place where things that are working well can result in cost savings for this upgrade. So in terms of concepts about this new layout system, perhaps you're familiar with the core blocks page on a Drupal 7 site, where all the possible blocks on the site are listed in a list form. And then the different regions have, different headers that's just all one on top of the other. And you can go into and configure each block separately and see whether any visibility conditions have been applied, which can get very cumbersome if you have a lot of blocks with a lot of different visibility conditions. So what Backdrop has done is implemented a concept of layouts to handle block placement on the page. And layouts, if you think of the entire page, the layout of a page, you can have a layout template that's applied to an entire section of the website or particular content type, that kind of thing. And the layout itself can have its own visibility conditions. So you can say, this layout only applies to the blog content type. So you can have a specific layout just for the blog, just for content that is of the blog type. And you can create any number of layouts. So within each of these layouts that have potentially visibility conditions, you place the blocks on the page, and the blocks themselves can again have their own visibility conditions. So, if you're looking at a layout for the blog, you can also have a block that only appears on a subset of the blog content. And as far as the layout templates, you can use the layout templates that Core provides. You can create custom layout templates in code. And there's even an interface that you can build flexible layout templates directly in the Backdrop user interface, if you desire. So for Bio-X, since we were doing an upgrade, we wanted that upgrade process to go as smoothly as possible. And we created a layout template that matched the theme that was in use on Drupal 7 in terms of the regions of the page, which made making sure that blocks that were placed in Drupal 7 could be put into the exact same region of the page in the layout system in Backdrop. And this is just a sample of what an administrative layout page could look like in Backdrop, where you can add blocks to different sections that are laid out actually, on the page instead of just in one huge long list. And you can add blocks to the different regions and drag and drop them, and then see it in a much more visual form than is available in Drupal 7. Getting at a few concepts related to the upgrade process. So because, as I mentioned, that's one of the major reasons that Backdrop should be a strong consideration if you have a Drupal 7 site, especially one that's working well for you. So many of the most used modules in Drupal 7 are already ported and available in Backdrop, or are already in Backdrop Core. So many of the modules that are used most prolifically from Drupal 7 have been incorporated directly into Backdrop Core, which is great from a administration perspective on a website, because it means that these modules are going to be with every upgrade of Backdrop, these modules are part of the package and don't have to be maintained separately, and don't have to worry about a module being abandoned and running old modules on the site. Even if there are modules you're using in Drupal 7 that aren't ported yet, generally speaking, it's not that hard to port modules because of the similarities in the code structure of Backdrop and Drupal 7. And that type of thing can be wrapped into the upgrade project costs without adding too much overhead. So if you have a site that really needs this particular module and it's either not available or it's only partly ported, that finishing that port or even doing that port from scratch can be wrapped into a project, and make sure that that module then becomes available for your Backdrop site. In the case of the Bio-X site, as part of the analysis, we found we could remove some modules that were in use in Drupal 7 but weren't really needed, or we found we could do in a slightly different way without needing to use those modules. So removing them at the outset of the project was a good idea. And then there were a few that we needed to port or polish as part of the process. And then as we went through the upgrade, we just kept good notes because we ran this process many times, this upgrade process, until it became so smooth and predictable that we were ready to do it for the final time. And as we ran through these multiple runs, you know, if we saw a warning here or an error there, we would fix those and submit a patch where needed, and then make sure that all the data came through without any warnings or errors for the final run. One thing I need to make special mention of here is the configuration management system that's included in Backdrop. It was so helpful in this process because during one of the trial runs that I described, we can do a bunch of work on views or layouts or other configuration, then export that configuration into a staging folder and commit that to the repository. Then we could take a fresh database dump from the live site, prepare it, re-import it, you know, run that import script, and then do a configuration sync, which would take all of those configuration changes that we had been working on and reapply them to the site on top of the fresh copy of the site content. So separating the content from the configuration settings is a enormous improvement in Backdrop versus Drupal 7. And then I mentioned this sort of notes to self document that I kept as I was going, and that helped make this. It was almost like a recipe that I could follow to take a fresh database from the live site, follow this recipe, and get to the upgraded version very quickly. A second document I kept was I thought of as an opportunity list. As I was working on the Drupal 7 site and upgrading it and testing different things and looking at the content, sometimes I noticed things that would come over as they were, but I thought could probably be improved. Taking those notes, they weren't really problems, but they were things that could be improved after the upgrade was complete. And so having that opportunity list was helpful after the upgrade was completed. We could take a look at that and prioritize and say, with all this extra budget, you know, what are we going to do first, second, third? And so that final upgrade process, as I mentioned, became very, very quick. And as I followed the recipe, it was, you know, take a copy of the live database, import it locally, run some various drush commands to, you know, tweak some things, export it to, you know, turn off different modules, etc. Export it as a file that was ready to be imported in Backdrop, and then running a few scripts on the database itself, because as we were working, we found some really old content that had some broken images and things like that. So changing a few things directly in the database right before import to make sure that they would function as hoped. So we ended up with a better version of the content in some cases on the Backdrop site than was on the Drupal 7 site. And then the post-upgrade steps in the document, trying to use B, which is the essentially the Backdrop version of drush to run those same various commands on the Backdrop side. In the end, it went so smoothly, we only needed 1 day of content freeze, which is incredible. And the time from downloading the live database to having a fully upgraded database locally, it was only about half an hour. And so that kind of gives you a sense of how quickly and smoothly that process got by the end. the whole upgrade process went so well that we had used just a little more than half of the allotted budget, which the entire allotted budget was already a fraction of what it would have been to migrate to another system. And so this efficiency left extra time to make further enhancements, optimizations, and improvements that went beyond the initial scope of upgrading. I mentioned that part of an upgrade, you sort of you get a lot of improvements in core, in Backdrop, and just a few examples that I'll mention here. The performance gains, it runs faster. There's a basic image library that comes in core now, so image fields or images that you upload into the editor can be selected from a library, so you don't have to end up with multiple copies of the same image when you're trying to add it to different pages. And administrative menu improvements, other usability, user interface improvements and adjustments. The menu system in Backdrop out of the box also has some accessibility improvements that I really like. It's one of my favorites because it's keyboard navigable by default, so it's much more accessible than most Drupal 7 menus, especially out of the box. And actually, as part of this project, we've submitted a pull request, which has now been merged and is in the latest release, to further improve these menus by giving more options about how they respond when it's in mobile mode. Whether the mobile view on the right-hand side of this screenshot here, you can see, so you can have like the entire thing be a link, or just the entire thing just be a toggle. So if it has a submenu, or the text can be a link and the plus sign can be a toggle, kind of split like that. So it opens up options like that to the user interface now. And at this point in the Bio-X project, improvements are still ongoing, but at this point we were able to start taking this list of opportunities and improvements, that some of the ones I had noted, some of the ones they had on their list from the beginning, and begin working through those in bite-sized chunks, so we can define the current priorities, produce fixes for review and testing, deploy that, go back to the list, define our next priorities, and try to do this in a way that has fewer moving parts, which is an approach that I like. So some examples listed here of some of the improvements that we've made or are in the process of making on Bio-X. We set it up to allow image styles to convert the image to a different format. If you're using like Google's Lighthouse or PageSpeed analytics kind of thing, it'll often tell you one way that you can improve your site is to convert your images to a next generation format. So in this case, we were able to set it up to convert to the WebP format for better optimization. We were able to make minor adjustments. They largely wanted the information architecture to stay the same, but after a number of years, there's always little tweaks you can make and improve and polish. So we could merge a few things, split vocabularies into separate places where it made sense, and that kind of thing. We're beginning to improve the authoring experience compared to Drupal 7 with some basic paragraphs that will allow different structured ways of adding specific types of content into a page itself. And then we worked on some social sharing things to improve that with meta tags and a specific image style that crops an image to a specific dimension and inserts the Bio-X logo, kind of a watermark in the bottom right, and just make it a little bit nicer for social sharing, as well as some tweaks for accessibility, usability, and search, and then better cross-linking. They have all these years of such amazing rich content, and they've done all this work over time of cross-referencing that to each other with different terms and categories and so on. And as part of the opportunities I noticed was to say, like, you've already done a lot of this work, and we could just expose some of that. I got a screenshot coming up that'll show you more what I mean there. This one here is just a quick screenshot of some of the visual improvements. So we didn't do a major theme overhaul, but as we were going, we noted like, oh, here, this could be improved, or this could be improved. And then, you know, end up with a much cleaner look at the end, even though it's, you know, still part of the same general theme that was there before, same type. So this one here is what I was referring to about the content that they had done a lot of work over the years on and sort of exposing it. We found, looking at their analytics, that the profile pages got quite a lot of traffic, but they have also a fairly high bounce rate. And so looking at this and realizing that behind the scenes, this profile is attached to a whole bunch of other content, made a lot of sense then to expose some of that content on this page. So not just for, you know, search engine optimization, but for users who may come in on a Google search for looking for information about this person, and they come to this page, giving them a menu of related content underneath is just, you know, good for them, obviously, to find more relevant content quickly. So that was the kind of thing that could be worked on in just adapting views and layouts after the fact. And then this was an improvement that they had called out, was that the default search functionality wasn't really providing them what they had hoped it would. And they wondered if we could, you know, without spending, you know, tons and tons and tons of time and money, if there's a way we could tweak it. And so we ended up, the default search implementation, and then revising the interface that people interact with it, so that they can get a more visual view up front, but then also using a little interface to filter very quickly and easily between types of content. So if they're looking for a person, they can just go to people. If they're looking for news, they can go to news and just very easily see that type of content. So